And then 2 or 3 years ago, there was also this report that there is now a secret department of the Pentagon, the largest secret army in the history of mankind, according to this article. 60,000 PR employees of the Pentagon who also have the task of going into social networks, creating accounts, posting messages, and influencing reporting. And these are all points where I say, we are obviously already dealing with a blatant manipulation of the media landscape. And if you want, you could also look at the World Economic Forum now. These cyber armies, which are very, very efficient, have become well known. During the pandemic, they had 100,000 so-called information volunteers in their service who acted against disinformation, false reports, etc. on the internet. And as a scientist, I just say, you have to look closely at these terms. What is actually disinformation? What is misinformation? It is not precisely defined, but this is how they repeatedly manage to exert a strong influence on public reporting. And the battle for digital space is, of course, in full swing here.
Something that strikes me about these narratives, and you also describe this in your second book, which we will discuss shortly, is that a cornerstone of these narratives is that they are extremely simple, very simplistic, extremely so. And something that then happens is that they also internally contradict themselves repeatedly. For example, in the war narrative against Russia, it is currently said, on one hand, that the Russians are the greatest threat to Europe since the existence of the continent, worse than the Soviet Union, and so on. At the same time, it was repeatedly said over a long period that no, Russia is weak, the army is running away, they can't do anything, they are losers. And both had to be believed simultaneously. There were similar contradictions with COVID, like the vaccine saves us, but everyone must have it, otherwise it doesn't work. That's a direct contradiction, but I've noticed that it becomes part of the narrative's dogma, which isn't questioned. Is this a component of how the whole thing works, also psychologically? Or am I seeing ghosts on the wall here?
I see it exactly the same way. It can actually be quite well explained with Edward Bernays and this confirmation bias. I believe that's an important point in this context that we carry within us. The confirmation bias essentially states that we are all built in such a way that we filter out new information. Specifically, we ask whether the new information fits with what we already know or contradicts it. If it fits and confirms what we already know, then we accept it and say, great, it fits, excellent information, I've learned something new again. When they contradict that, and when there is such cognitive dissonance, when we deal with it, we tend to simply reject the new information and say, no, I'm not interested, it's irrelevant. And so it is simply the case that this rational discourse, which would actually be super important in democracy, and as you say, that we simply engage in complex discussions about issues, that we illuminate different facets, that we openly present arguments and just discuss, is very, very difficult for us because we all really dislike being convinced of the opposite. And I mean, many viewers who are hearing this now might ask themselves how often we actually enter a discussion and say, now I'm going to let myself be completely convinced of the opposite. Or do we enter the discussion and say, I know what's right, and I'm going to convince my counterpart that he or she is wrong. And that's how we all are, of course. And then it becomes difficult to have a rational exchange. And that's when these simple narratives, this emotional playground, come into play. And that's where we get to Bernays, who recognized this very well. He already said back then, if we believe that we can convince people rationally, we are deceiving ourselves. We have to work emotionally in propaganda, and then we have very simple emotional messages. If we just stick to the narratives, it's simply a story where it must be completely clear who the enemy is, who is currently evil. If it were inhumane, then there's always this demonizing devaluation at play. The opposing president is a devil anyway. That's also a strategy. We've already had that in the First World War. And as you say, then you have super simple narratives that don't make much sense when you look at them rationally. In the First World War, there were posters, for example, in the USA from this Creel Commission. They had grotesque faces, really with bared teeth, etc. And they also had a helmet on, a spiked helmet, which was supposed to represent the German soldiers.
Das sollten die deutschen Soldaten sein. Die hatten einen blutigen Knüppel in der Hand, die hatten eine Jungfrau.
They had a bloody club in their hand. They had a virgin on their arm. And then it was said, these are the Germans, and now off to war. And if you ask rationally, wait a minute, does this actually make sense? Is this message that we are dealing with beasts, or are they not also humans? Is it really true? That means they fall apart when you recognize the techniques. When you rationally consider, can this really be? But propaganda does not work rationally. It works purely emotionally. It targets feelings. Very simple narratives that we can absorb super quickly, where we don't need much cognitive effort to internalize the messages, so to speak. And precisely because of this, it is still so efficient today.
Ist sie auch heute noch so effizient?
Vielleicht eine letzte Frage zu dem Thema, aber wie...
Perhaps one last question on the topic. How do we best defend ourselves against it? As individuals, we not only have to defend ourselves against disinformation campaigns.
Wie verteidigt man sich als Individuum gegen kognitive Kriegsführung?
Also mir ist einfach wichtig, dass
What is important to me is that just as you have said, this trust, which is being fought for, is at the center. Cognitive warfare is always a battle for trust. Whom do we trust? And I simply try to first provide people with these lenses. How do the techniques actually work? And then people can put on these lenses, so to speak, when they know propaganda is being used, dehumanization is being employed. I have the majority effect, where I always claim that the majority is already convinced of a certain thing. I have authority figures where I say well-known person XY, highly decorated scientist, politician, whoever, says it too.
Politikerin, Politiker, wer auch immer sagt es auch. Und so kann man eigentlich so einen Werkzeug...
And so you can actually build a toolbox of manipulation that works very, very effectively in combination. And the more people know these techniques, and this is something I'm very passionate about, the more they can question these manipulation techniques. They can neutralize manipulation when they realize that cognitive warfare always seeks approval for acts of war. It wants us to harbor enemy images, to agree to arms deliveries, to think it's good when certain countries are fought against. And I say when you realize that warlike violence, that military force, this hard power, is never a way to resolve conflicts.
Ist nie ein Weg, Konflikte zu lösen. Die führt auch nicht zu mehr Demokratie, die führt auch nicht zu mehr Menschenrechten.
It doesn't lead to more democracy. It doesn't lead to more human rights, no matter what simple stories are told. But in the end, they always lead only to suffering, death, and trauma. And if we also realize that these soft power techniques, this manipulative interaction, ultimately do not lead to more democracy, not to a rational discourse, to a well-founded exchange of ideas, that we ensure we do not devalue or manipulate each other, that we resolve conflicts without violence, and that we very carefully ask ourselves, whom do I trust now? If we succeed in this, then we have already neutralized cognitive warfare to a great extent, and I am also convinced that we can achieve this.
Und ich bin auch überzeugt davon, dass wir das schaffen können.
I'm glad that we are ending the first part of the conversation on such an optimistic note. We'll be right back with the second part.
Zum zweiten Teil.